All right, so we had developed the ISLN model last time, and we finished up by saying, okay, but this is a course on international finance. So what does this model imply for exchange rates? And I said, well, you can kind of use them in one model, all right, by just taking this graph that we've been working with really the whole term and kind of flipping it on its side. And then we can use what I think is kind of a graphical representation of the Mundell funding theory to analyze the effects of monetary and fiscal policy on exchange rates. Okay, so let's review that. All right, so the first thing we looked at was the first arrow of Abenomics. What is the effect, and we're looking here in the short run, okay, of an increase in the money supply. And let's start with, let me sort of say this, what we've been looking at so far is really looking at short-run effects of temporary changes in policy. All right, that's what we graphed, and that's what I'm going to review right now. All right. So a temporary increase in the money supply in the short run. Short run is defined how? What's the short run to economists? How long is it? The short run means prices are fixed or sticky. They don't move. They haven't adjusted. Okay? So the price level stays fixed or sticky. The money supply increases, and that means that the real money supply increases. All right, anyway, what this will do is what is it? I don't want to guess. What's your name again? Toshi showed us. Shifts the LM curve down. Okay, and we end up with higher output, lower interest rates, and a depreciated yen, which is what we saw happening. Okay, why? Because as long as prices are, fixed and haven't adjusted, which is our definition of the short run, an increase in the money supply means an increase in real money balances. Okay, so this money supply curve, real money supply curve, shifts out to the right. To keep, and this is what I was wondering if you could think of, to keep money markets in equilibrium, right? So if we stay at R1, money markets will be out of equilibrium, right? We have more money supply, real money supply, than real aggregate money demand. So to keep money markets in equilibrium, which means to keep real aggregate money supply equal to real aggregate money demand, the interest rate has to fall. And we move along the money demand curve down here to a new lower interest rate. That's sort of why interest rates have to fall. Okay. So our LN curve shifts and we move along the IS curve to the new lower interest rate, R2 here. Okay, and the new higher output level, Y prime here. And if this is a temporary monetary policy change, okay, and I think you might argue that Abenomics is trying to get a permanent one, okay, but anyway, in a normal case where it's temporary, that means that exchange rate expectations don't change. Our future expected exchange rate doesn't change. Okay, so this curve, our expected return on foreign currency deposits measured in the domestic currency, which is the yen, it doesn't shift or anything, it just stays right there. And that means that when the interest rate changes from R1 to R2, the exchange rate depreciates, the yen depreciates from E1 to E2. Does anybody have a question about that? Okay, and how about arrow number 2, expansionary fiscal policy? Expansionary fiscal policy, if it's temporary, okay, it only shifts the IS curve, not the LM curve, and we end up, as we saw, with higher output, higher interest rates, and an appreciated exchange rate. The yen gets stronger. How does that work? Well, again, in the short run, which is defined as the period during which prices are sort of sticky or maybe even fixed, all right, in increasing government spending, if you increase G and you do a lot of spending to build new roads, repair bridges, whatever, fix things, you're going to shift up aggregate demand. What we called our DD curve, which is aggregate demand, shifts up because Y equals C plus I plus G plus current account. So we increase G, we're increasing Y in equilibrium, right? So if the goods market stays in equilibrium, which is here where Y equals D, the increase in aggregate demand gives us an increase in output, or Y. So we move from Y1 to Y2. Okay, that is what shifts the IS curve. So the IS curve shifts out. For any given interest rate, output is now higher. The IS curve shifts out. The economy moves, in a sense, along the LM curve to a new short-run temporary equilibrium, which has higher output and higher interest rates. This is the ISLN model. And then if we expand that to Mundell funding analysis, what happens to exchange rates? Well, if this is a temporary increase in G, in government spending, our expected return on foreign currency deposits hasn't changed because our expectation of kind of long-run future exchange rates has not changed. This curve stays where it is. And a shift out of the IS curve, or an increase in the domestic interest rate from R1 to R2, means we've got to get an appreciation of the yen from E1 to E2. Okay, before we go into that question, let me just flash you this poem. So, a long time ago, somebody turned in a comment sheet that I've been waiting to address, saying, which policy works immediately? Monetary policy or fiscal policy? Does anybody remember the answer to that question from the principles of macro class? Which one works quicker? Yeah, that's right. So monetary policy, do you know why? Why does it work quicker?
Isn't fiscal policy trickling down?
Well, there's a fiscal multiplier that could take a little time to work. But I think the more straightforward answer is that central banks in most countries are independent. They're not elected officials. And they have a mandate, to keep inflation low and stable in most cases. And they can react immediately. They don't need to have a vote or approval from anybody to expand or contract the money supply. So the central banks can react very quickly to stabilize the economy. If there's deflation, they can expand the money supply. If there's inflation, they can contract the money supply. And they don't need anyone's permission. I mean, they do need approval from the board, the Monetary Policy Board. But it's much simpler than if you want fiscal policy, where you have to go through and have approval from the entire parliament, for the entire diet, or the Senate and the House, Congress. That takes a long time, and it's subject to really political fighting. Usually central bank decisions are less political and therefore quicker. And you could see that was true as Abenomics was implemented, right? Very, very, very soon after Abe was elected and he got Kuroda as the head of the central bank, very quickly they began this expansion of quantitative easing to what they call QQE, qualitative and quantitative expansionary monetary policy, or easing. So usually the fiscal policy comes first. Usually the monetary policy comes first, and then fiscal policy takes a little while to come in. And that's what we saw with Abenomics. The monetary policy was implemented immediately, then fiscal policy. So far, what have you seen in terms of exchange rates? Does it follow this? Can anybody argue yes or no? Does it follow the implications of the Monroe model? Well, think about that for a minute, and let me show you what I really think happens. Okay, this is still, we can get, even with this model that you learn as undergraduates in one level class, we can get an even richer kind of analysis of the effects of policy. by thinking about this next question, which is, what if our policy were not temporary, but it were permanent? Okay, now what is permanent? Well, what permanent really is, okay, what's temporary government spending? Temporary government spending is like, we're going to build a space shuttle and go to the moon. And when it's done, we're going to stop spending it. And then it's done. You know, permanent government spending is like, we're going to start a new space program forever. And every year it's going to need a budget. That's sort of conceptually the difference between temporary and permanent fiscal policy. But again, economists have sort of a technical, tricky way of defining what's permanent and temporary. And really, in our model, what we think of as a permanent change in monetary policy or fiscal policy is something that it changes markets' expectations about future exchange rates. Why? Well, one way to think about it is that in the long run, what's our long run? Most of the models we've talked about for determining exchange rates are short run, right? Most of them. What is the long run model of exchange rates? What is it? I'll give you a big hint. It's what you're writing in your term paper. It's purchasing power parity, right? That is the long run model. In the long run, in the really, really long run, what do we think determines exchange rates? Well, it has something to do with the prices of comparable baskets of goods. Okay, so maybe it's not absolute PPP, but it's relative PPP, or it's some variant of PPP, purchasing power parity. Right. So if monetary policy or fiscal policy are permanent, that means they're around long enough to affect price changes, prices. And that means they're going to affect the long-run exchange rate. And that means that the market players or investors in financial markets, when the policy is implemented, it immediately changes their expectation of future exchange rates. Did you kind of follow that argument? I think I have it written up here. So permanent policy shifts affect not only the current money supply that we just looked at, not only current government spending or taxes, we just looked at an example of government spending, but they also affect the long-run exchange rate, and market participants know that. So they affect exchange rate expectations. So because permanent policy changes affect expectations, that means they can have different effects in temporary policy changes. So first, let's consider the effects of a permanent monetary policy change, expansionary monetary policy, but it's permanent, let's say. All right, well, this is what it'll look like. It'll look just like what we just graphed on the board and what we just reviewed. We're still going to get a shift down in the LM curve. All right, but the minute this policy is announced, market participants' expectations of future exchange rates change. And that shifts this curve, the expected return on foreign currency deposits measured in the domestic currency, it shifts it out, you might say. It shifts it out immediately. And this, I believe that for some reason I was teaching this course on the day Abe was elected. And you saw immediately the yen reacting. And there had not yet been any change in monetary policy. So that impact of just this person who had announced a policy plan being elected, it immediately changed market expectations of future exchange rates. And it fit perfectly with this model. All right, so let's go through a little bit more step by step, okay? So again, in the short run, we're still talking about short run, it's a permanent change, but we're analyzing the impact of the short run. So in the short run, prices are sticky, they don't adjust right away, right? We don't adjust wages or prices, every minute. It takes a while, so they're sticky. A permanent increase in money supply, therefore, increases the real money supply, which shifts this money supply curve out to the right. To maintain equilibrium in money markets, the interest rate has to fall so that money supply equals money demand. And we're at a new lower equilibrium interest rate, R2, just like last time, okay? Just like a temporary increase in the money supply did. And again, just like a temporary increase in the money supply, that shifts the LN curve down, right? The economy moves, in a sense, along the IS curve to a new equilibrium at the lower interest rate and a higher output level. Okay, but what's different? This time, what's different is if the monetary policy change is viewed as permanent, the market participants know, this monetary policy is in place until prices rise. They're just going to keep doing it until prices rise. Prices will eventually go up. The exchange rate, because of purchasing power parity, it will eventually depreciate. So in the case of a permanent increase in money supply, the expected future exchange rate is affected, whereas when it's temporary, it wasn't. So what does that do? The expected return on foreign currency deposits shifts out. So instead of a depreciation from E1 to E2, like we got with the temporary change, we get a huge depreciation from E1 to E3. It's bigger. Do you have any questions about this?
Are there any specific examples of that?
Yes. What would make Abenomics is a good example of permanent monetary policy. Why? What makes that permanent? What makes that sort of permanent in the sense that I need it in this model is a couple of things. And I would say, one, a very public, vocal, open, announced on the front page of every major newspaper kind of promise. We will do this until deflation is gone. We will do this until prices rise. That's kind of permanent. If it's convincing. I mean, it all depends if it's convincing. I think it was convincing. Number two, we talked about this before, right? The change in the language of the Bank of Japan. So they go from, Medo to Mokyo. They're changing from what you might call a goal to a very clear word that in English has very strong ideology associated with it, which is target. I mean, inflation targeting is an ideology. It's like a school of economics. Some people think central banks should do an inflation target. And so changing that language and shifting to what was interpreted by the international press as a change to inflation targeting, and making that target higher from like 1% to 2%. That also makes it permanent because it sort of convinces market participants that this expansionary monetary policy is going to be here until they hit this very clear target that's higher of 2%. And the other thing is, the other term I might want to mention here came up in one of the articles we read, and that is the term forward guidance. So forward guidance, I said, I'm not sure if it's anything new, but the economist thinks it's new. So forward guidance is, speaking very clearly to your market participants, through the press. Speaking very clearly to your market participants about what you're going to do. And I would say that both Kuroda and, for example, Bernanke, who used to be head of the Fed, and Janet Yellen, who has replaced Bernanke at the Fed, they all are trying to be very, very clear you know, this policy is in place until X happens. And in the case of Japan, it was a 2% inflation target. So I think you could make a good argument that the expansionary monetary policy that's part of Abenomics fits this definition of permanent monetary policy. Does anybody feel they want to challenge that? Because I think I do want to just mention to you that I think market participants are starting to like get a little, you know, skeptical. They're starting to get a little bit skeptical. But when it was first announced, it was clearly interpreted by the market as a change, a regime change in monetary policy. Why? Does anybody like read the news about the BOJ? You know, what were they saying before? What was so different? We've been doing quantitative easing for forever, right, in Japan. What was different about the language of the Bank of Japan? Shirakawa versus Kuroda. Does anybody know? So Shirakawa would sort of say, you know, well, we're going to keep up our bond purchases of whatever million yen every month, and we're going to keep up quantitative easing and expanding the monetary policy, but we don't think it's going to work until there's structural reform. Like there was always a but afterwards. So they were really doing QE, you know, very aggressively, actually, compared to other countries, very aggressively. But the language coming out of the head of the Bank of Japan was very different. And there was sort of a fight, in a sense, a public fight, you know, in the newspapers. A sort of a fight between the Bank of Japan, which felt like, well, everybody's putting the burden on us, we need to increase monetary policy, but that's not going to work unless the banks are restructured and, you know, the government debt is addressed, you know, so we'll do this, but it's not going to work. You know, it's not really going to work until other people get their economic house in order. They're sort of fighting publicly in that way. You know, indirectly, but if you read between the lines, they were fighting. And so when Shirakawa left and Kuroda came in, and he was sort of chosen by Abe, you know, pretty blatantly. He was, in a sense, a pretty political choice for a central bank governor. The language of the Bank of Japan changed very markedly. And they were no longer saying, we're going to do this, but we don't think it's going to work. They were like, we're going to do this, we're going to get an inflation target of 2%, this will happen, and we will do it until it happens. It was a very change in language and forward guidance. And I think you saw expectations in markets changing when he was elected, when Kuroda finally came in and took the head. Now, I think I might want to make one comment about the timing. What's the timing of this? What happened first? This or this? Exchange rate expectations changed. Yeah. So actually, when I was presenting it to you, I sort of talked you through, this is what would happen when the monetary policy implemented, and then, oh look, but if it's permanent, exchange rate expectations change. But actually, in reality, if you think of the case of Japan, it happened in the opposite order. So exchange rate expectations changed the minute really Abe was elected. They changed a little bit more the minute Kuroda took over as head of the Bank of Japan. And then after he was head of the Bank of Japan, then he actually implemented the monetary policy. And then we saw the LM curve shift down, and we got a little bit more depreciation. So that's why you've seen the depreciation kind of come in kind of starts and stops or jerks, I guess. So we had a big one when Abe's elected, a little bit more when Kuroda took over, a little bit more as the QQE kind of plan was announced and implemented. So markets react to new information and very immediate reaction. Okay, how about a permanent change in fiscal policy? Yes?
If they keep on raising the
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So this is one challenge you can make to this model. You know, how do we use this model when we have zero interest rates? Can you kind of visualize the answer? How would you use this in a zero interest rate environment? Can we use it? If we have time, we're getting to the end of the term actually. If we have time, we could do this as an exercise in class. But in case we don't have time, because I want to do fixed exchange rates too, let me just give you a quick answer. So the situation in Japan is that Japan's not in equilibrium, right? Japan's way down here. The IS curve is so far shifted, we're down here. All right. At really kind of negative real rates at least. You can't get negative nominal rates, but negative real rates. Okay. Maybe, anyway. Zero or negative. Okay. And so, even if the LM curve shifts down, we can't really get negative interest rates, right? They have a zero interest rate policy because we can't get interest rates down anymore. So what we really have is sort of discontinuity, I guess, in what the IS curve looks like. So the IS curve looks like this, and then it's flat here because it can't really go to negative rates. It's kinked. Economists call it kinked. Okay. So even if the LM curve shifts down, let me draw it. It's maybe hard to visualize. Okay, so maybe Japan was here. The asset bubble burst, and it ended up here. Interest rates are pretty much at zero. Okay, so what happens when the central bank implements expansionary monetary policy? So they can still do that. That's what QE is. QE is, well, interest rates are zero, so we're just going to buy a lot of bonds and buy longer-term bonds. Okay. So in a sense, what you get is an IS curve that kind of looks like this. It's kinked here. So when the LM curve shifts down, you just move from here to here. And there's no impact on the interest rate because it can't go any lower than zero. So what does that do in our model of exchange rates? Well, you can't really get any changes in exchange rates, right? From our model. That's why convincing the market, that's why, you know, Abenomics, you can very much debate whether it's good economics or not. I think it's very debatable. It's an interesting policy debate. But politically, it was just brilliant, 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 brilliant. Why? Because it just convinced markets. Markets may be getting skeptical now, a year later, but for a while, markets were very convinced this is going to happen. And so what it did, in a sense, because of the political astuteness of the way it was carried out, is it shifted this expected return on foreign currency deposits out because everybody expected depreciation. So even if you can't get interest rates down below zero, you can change expectations by announcing it's permanent. This is in place until we get inflation. You can still affect the exchange rate. So that's probably more realistically what really happened. Yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, let's look at fiscal policy then. What about permanent fiscal policy? So, let me pose a question for you that you guys should ask me, but you're a little quiet today, so I don't think you're going to ask. You know, but is it really possible to have permanent expansionary fiscal policy? Let's think about that, okay, and come back to it. But suppose it is. So we have a permanent increase in government spending. Suppose we have that, right? What happens? So a permanent increase in government spending, it leads to higher output and an appreciated exchange rate, just like the temporary increase we just looked at, okay, because it does the same thing. It shifts the IS curve. Oops, my arrow's going the wrong way. It should be going out instead of up. Shifts the IS curve out, okay. It raises the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate, in order to keep money markets in equilibrium. That leads to an appreciation of the currency, right? But instead of an appreciation from E1 to E2, we get a bigger appreciation from E1 to E3, because if it's permanent, when it's implemented, or when it's announced for that matter, it changes market participants' expectations of the long-run exchange rate, and they begin to expect this appreciation. And so this expected return on foreign currency deposits, measured in the domestic currency, shifts in. And that means that as the exchange rate rises, we get a bigger appreciation in the exchange rate to E3 instead of E2. So let me go through what I just said step by step with some graphs. So in the short run, if prices are sticky, a temporary increase in government spending increases aggregate demand, right? Because Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, or CA, and G is in there. To maintain equilibrium in the goods market, which is what the IS curve represents, all right, output has to go up too. So here aggregate demand rose, but aggregate demand has to equal output in equilibrium, so we end up over here at a higher output level, Y2. So far, just like the temporary increase in government spending. That increase in equilibrium output shifts the IS curve out from IS to IS prime. Okay, and we move along the LN curve to a new higher interest rate. Why do we have to have a higher interest rate? Because IS curve is goods market equilibrium, LN curve is money market equilibrium. And our increase in output raises real aggregate money demand. Remember that L is a function of Y and R. So to keep money markets in equilibrium, R has to go up to bring down money demand. So they stay in equilibrium because the money supply didn't change. Because the increase in government spending is permanent, though, market participants are now expecting a long-run appreciation of the currency. And their expectations can actually change immediately. But anyway, the expected future exchange rate changes. It shifts this expected return on foreign currency deposits in, right? And to maintain interest parity, the domestic currency has to appreciate, and if it's permanent fiscal policy, it appreciates even more than if it's temporary. Does anybody have a question about this? Why don't we do an application of this? So do you understand it? You have no questions, so you understand it well enough to do a little application. Okay. So I'm going to let you, so that you can wake up and get refreshed a little bit. Kind of work in groups, but let me give you a problem to work on that will try to apply this, okay? So we've looked at the first two arrows of Abenomics, right? Let's consider something else that is happening. I'll keep the Abenomics pictures up here for you. Okay. But what happened when Janet Yellen was confirmed as the new Fed chair? What happened in currency markets? Did any of you see it? Read about it, hear about it in the news? What happened in Turkey, in India, and South Africa? Some of these fragile 5 countries that we discussed earlier. Did any of you hear in the news what happened? Yeah. And what did Turkey have to do? Well, maybe it's better that you don't know, or at least you're not confident to say out loud. Because let's see what the model would imply. And then maybe some of you who have internet devices. You can check and see what really happened. But I think it fit this model pretty well. Okay? But what is that? Let's say that this is Turkey, okay? So this is Turkey. Turkey has an IS curve and an LN curve, of course. Okay? And it was at some, temporary equilibrium interest rate, output level, and exchange rate. And this is the Turkish lira, let's say to US dollar exchange rate here, okay? So we're looking at this from Turkey's point of view, okay? So here's your question. When Janet Yellen was, when she had her confirmation hearings, what did she say? Is she going to change Fed policy a lot? No, she's not. I mean, actually, before her confirmation, do you know what her reputation is? Maybe I told you already. Is she kind of viewed as an inflation hawk or a dove? She's viewed as a dove, means soft on inflation, not going to fight inflation really badly. So apparently, and I can only tell this in retrospect, apparently, some market participants thought that meant that she would not taper, means cut down on the Fed's quantitative easing as aggressively as Bernanke had. Do you know what I mean by taper? Okay, you know what QE is, right? Quantitative easing. That's a big increase in the money supply, right? And the Fed, under Bernanke, has used this word taper. They want to communicate, they're doing forward guidance, they want to communicate very clearly with markets. We're going to taper, it means like gradually reduce the amount of bond purchases. So they are very gradually actually they're going to keep doing QE, but they're going to sort of slow down the pace a little bit. So it's a very gradual work. They're trying to tell market participants, don't get excited, nothing, fast is going to happen here. We're going to have a slow, gradual tapering to end QE as the economy normalizes. Okay. And then it turns out that Janet Yellen is picked by President Obama to be the next chair of the Fed. She's viewed as a dove, right? She's actually gone on the record some, say some things, makes her sound dovish. So market participants thought, if she's a dove, I don't know, maybe she won't taper as much. Okay. But then she went to her confirmation hearings, and what did she say? She said pretty much the same thing Bernanke has been saying, all along. Yes, it depends on the data, but yes, we're planning to taper. So yes, we're going to taper. Okay, now when she said that, there was a big reaction in lots of Fragile Five economies, including Turkey. Okay, so here's the question for you to discuss. Two questions. So the first question is this, and as always, I want you to use the model, right? Not just give your opinion, but kind of use the model, see what the model implies. Right? So how do we analyze the effects of Janet Yellen's kind of recommitment, publicly saying I'm still committed to a Fed taper of QE, quantitative easing, on not the US dollar, but the Turkish lira? How do you analyze that? Using this Mundell funding model. Here's Turkey. Okay, how do you analyze that? And number two, what do you think Turkey's central bank should have done? And if you have time, why don't you check what they really did do? So did what you thought would happen in one really happen? Did what you thought they should do in number two did they really do it? And I wonder, do you need a little break? Why don't we take like a 5-minute break? And then you come back and you can work in small groups, like 2 or 3. So maybe you guys on this side can rearrange your seats a little bit. And see what you can come up with as an answer to this. Try to apply this model to real life. Okay, so let's meet back here at like 2:15 and you can start working in groups.